I'm Olivia Jensen, 29 years old, and the sanctuary I painstakingly carved out of the world, the apartment I poured 5 long years of my soul and savings into, had just been detonated as the explosive epicenter of our family's unique brand of drama. It happened, as these things often did, with a casual cruelty disguised as familial concern, during our ritualistic monthly Sunday dinner at my parents' house. The scent of my mother's predictable pot roast, a smell usually associated with a comforting, if sometimes stifling, tradition, was thick in the air when my parents, with the nonchalance of discussing the weather, casually announced, "Olivia, dear, it's all settled. Your sister, Rachel, will be moving into your apartment." Just like that. No consultation, no gentle inquiry, no "would you mind," as if my meticulously kept hard-earned space, my refuge from the world, was nothing more than a community center annex, available for their immediate allocation. I remember the clink of my wine glass against my teeth as I took a too-quick sip, the cheap Merlot suddenly tasting like ash. I managed a jerky nod, a pathetic imitation of assent, while internally a silent primal scream was clawing its way up my throat, a torrent of "No, absolutely not, how dare you." The look in my mother's eyes, that familiar blend of unwavering resolve and feigned maternal sweetness, stated unequivocally that this was not a proposal open for discussion. It was a decree. And my sister Rachel's smile, oh, that insufferably smug, entitled curve of her lips, as she glanced at me with a flicker of triumph, told me everything else I needed to comprehend. She knew. They all knew this was an ambush. Before I delve into the intricate, maddening details of how this family coup unfolded, and the desperate, unconventional measures I took next, do me a favor and drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from tonight. And hey, if you've ever had those cherished family members, the ones who seem to view your clearly marked boundaries as mere polite suggestions, or perhaps even a fun new obstacle course, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You're in good company here. Growing up as the often invisible middle child, in the meticulously curated world of the Jensen family, meant a lifetime spent navigating the long of shadows cast by rampant perfectionism and a bewildering system of expectations, a system that seemed to possess an infuriatingly flexible set of rules, applying them quite differently to each of us 3 siblings. Being the first in our immediate family to actually graduate from college, to walk across that stage and receive a diploma, that piece of paper represented years of grueling, relentless effort. It meant something profound to me, a personal Everest conquered, but to my parents, bless their selective vision, internal laugh, it registered as almost nothing. My education, my hard-won degree, was perceived not as the significant achievement it truly was, especially for someone who juggled 3 part-time, soul-crushing jobs while somehow maintaining a full academic scholarship, but rather as the bare expected minimum, the starting line, not the finish. My apartment, nestled in a surprisingly quiet street in downtown Portland, wasn't just an assembly of 4 walls and a ceiling. It wasn't merely the exposed brick I'd lovingly restored, or the way the early morning sunlight would stream through the large, east-facing windows, painting the polished hardwood floors a warm, buttery gold. No, it was so much more than that. It was a tangible monument to every single extra shift I'd picked up at the campus coffee shop, the smell of stale coffee and burnt sugar clinging to me for hours. It represented every late-night tutoring session I'd squeezed in, between mountains of coursework and exhaustion, my brain buzzing with caffeine and other people's problems. It stood for every single penny I had painstakingly saved, every impulse purchase resisted, every invitation to join friends for spontaneous weekend getaways, or even just a casual dinner out, that I'd reluctantly, painfully, declined. When I finally signed that lease 2 years ago, my hand trembling slightly as I penned my name, I felt, for the first time in my adult life, like I possessed something that was entirely, unequivocally mine. Something solid, a physical manifestation of my independence, from a family dynamic that had, for as long as I could remember, consistently left me feeling like I was gasping for air, starved for genuine recognition, that wasn't tied to how well I served their needs or reflected their ideals. My older sister, Rachel, had always been the designated golden child, the radiant sun around which the Jensen family planets seemed to orbit. She was the artist, the free spirit, the one whose supposed prodigious artistic talents were endlessly celebrated, culminating in occasional gallery showings of rather mediocre work. Internal laugh, if I'm being brutally honest, though I'd never say it aloud, lavishly funded by my ever-indulgent parents. Meanwhile, my academic achievements, my scholarships, my consistent place on the dean's list, warranted nothing more than a perfunctory, dismissive, "Oh, that's nice, Olivia," usually delivered over lukewarm dinner, before the conversation inevitably, rapidly, veered back to Rachel's latest artistic crisis or social drama. Rachel treated our parents' house not as a home she had left, but as a high-end hotel with a revolving door policy, a place she could sweep in and out of at her convenience, usually trailing chaos and emotional debris in her wake. Her returns were always precipitated by another spectacularly failed romantic relationship, the details of which were always dramatic, and never or another promising career setback, a dream job abandoned because the boss didn't appreciate her vision, or the work wasn't fulfilling enough. Internal laugh. She'd arrived dramatically on their doorstep, suitcases overflowing with designer clothes I knew for a fact were bought with our parents' generously supplied credit card, her eyes artfully brimming with tears, as she recounted, in painstaking detail, just how unfairly life and everyone in it had treated her. And Mom and Dad, bless their enabling hearts, internal laugh, would comfort her, soothe her, and then promptly present her with solutions that required no effort on her part. Spare keys to their fully stocked vacation property on the coast, a brand new car to help her get back on her feet after the last one was mysteriously damaged, or simply a hefty infusion of cash into her bank account. Meanwhile, I, the responsible, self-sufficient Olivia, continued to drive the same aging, slightly battered, used Honda Civic I'd bought with my own earnings back in college. I maintained it meticulously, changing the oil myself, learning basic repairs via YouTube tutorials, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that no gleaming replacement chariot would be magically appearing in my driveway if it finally sputtered its last breath. My younger brother, Ethan, was the cherished baby of the family, the perpetually coddled youngest. He was, and seemingly always would be, excused from the burdens of responsibility, because he was perpetually finding himself. Internal laugh. This journey of self-discovery apparently involved a long and expensive series of abandoned hobbies, from pottery, one lopsided vase to show for it, to coding. He lasted 2 weeks into an online boot camp, to gourmet cooking. Our parents' kitchen still bore the scars. These ventures, along with a string of half-finished online courses in vaguely artistic or philosophical subjects, were all enthusiastically funded by my parents, without a single question asked about progress or potential return on investment. The three of us Jensen siblings existed in these strange separate orbits within the same family solar system, each of us receiving and internalizing vastly different sets of expectations and wildly disparate levels of support. And I, Olivia, was always caught in the uncomfortable, gravitational pull of the middle, somehow expected to be both fiercely independent and endlessly, unconditionally accommodating, often simultaneously. The pattern of my parents making significant, life-altering decisions that directly affected my life, my time, my resources, without so much as a cursory consultation with me, wasn't a novel experience. Far from it. I remember with a vivid, lingering bitterness the summer when I was 16. They had blithely volunteered me to babysit my cousin's 3 rambunctious, hyperactive children every single weekend for the entire 3-month summer break. They informed me of this extensive, unpaid commitment only after they'd already made the promise, presenting it to me as a delightful opportunity, internal laugh, rather than the summer-long sentence it felt like. My plans for a summer job, for spending time with my own friends, evaporated in an instant. Then, during my sophomore year of college, when I was living in a tiny, slightly run-down off-campus apartment, they generously gave my address, and I suspect, a key they'd surreptitiously copied, to a group of distant, barely known relatives who were visiting from out of state, and apparently needed a convenience, and more importantly, internal laugh-free place to stay during a large family wedding. My parents called me with this delightful news on the very morning of their arrival, leaving me scrambling to cleanings to find spare bedding I didn't own, and to mentally prepare for a week of sharing my already cramped personal space with strangers. Each time I had attempted, however tentatively, to establish even the most basic of boundaries, to voice a preference, or a prior commitment, I was met with a predictable barrage of accusation. I was being selfish, ungrateful, unwilling to contribute to the family. I would be solemnly reminded of sacrosanct family obligations, obligations that, through some mysterious alchemy, internal laugh, never seemed to apply with the same rigor, or indeed at all, to either Rachel or Ethan. The past year, however, had felt different, hopeful, even. I'd finally found my professional footing, excelling in my career as an environmental consultant. The work was challenging, meaningful, and crucially, it brought me a sense of respect and external validation that didn't depend on the fickle, often conditional, approval of my family. More significantly, I had started seeing a therapist, a wonderfully insightful woman named Dr. Evans. She was patiently, skillfully helping me understand that setting boundaries wasn't an act of selfishness, as my family had conditioned me to believe, but rather a necessary, vital act of self-preservation, essential for my mental and emotional health. Armed with this new understanding, I had even managed to successfully decline hosting the annual Thanksgiving dinner, a mammoth, exhausting undertaking that had always fallen to me by default. Breaking that particular tradition, one that had consistently left me feeling depleted, resentful, and utterly unappreciated, felt like a monumental victory, a quiet revolution. These small, hard-won victories, these tiny shifts in the ingrained power dynamics, had made me feel like I was finally, slowly, painstakingly, gaining some measure of control over my relationship with my family. I was beginning to establish myself as an adult with her own choices, her own needs, her own life, rather than the perpetual, accommodating people-pleaser they had always expected and relied upon me to be. The monthly family dinners at my parents' home remained my concession to tradition, my olive branch. I viewed them as a controlled environment, a carefully managed interaction, where I could maintain some semblance of connection, without sacrificing too much of my newly fortified self. Little did I know, as I walked into their house that fateful Sunday, that this particular dinner, this seemingly innocuous gathering, would test every single boundary I had worked so incredibly hard to establish over the past year. It would force me to confront a stark, terrifying choice, once and for all. Was I willing to truly stand up for myself, for my life, for my space, even when it meant standing entirely alone, facing the united front of my family's formidable expectations and inevitable disapproval? The rich, familiar aroma of my mother's signature pot roast, slow-cooked with carrots and onions, a dish that usually signaled comfort and the illusion of family harmony, filled the warm air of the house as I arrived. I was precisely 10 minutes late. This small, almost imperceptible act of defiance was a monthly ritual I allowed myself, a tiny assertion of control, in a dynamic where I often felt I had none. My father, David Jensen, answered the door, his movements typically brisk, almost impatient. He gave me his standard, slightly awkward, one-armed hug, and immediately launched into his usual commentary on the state of Portland traffic, as if my meticulously timed 10-minute delay was a personal affront to his schedule, a direct consequence of city mismanagement, rather than my deliberate choice. Rachel, my older sister, was already there. Naturally, she was artfully perched on the edge of the living room sofa, the one covered in my mother's favorite floral chintz, a nearly full glass of red wine, held delicately in one hand. Her expensive-looking designer boots, the ones I suspected were a recent gift from Mom and Dad, were propped carelessly on our mother's prized antique coffee table, a delicate mahogany piece from her own grandmother. It was a liberty I, Olivia, would never have been granted, not in a million years, if I'd so much as rested a coasterless mug on its polished surface. I'd have received a sharp lecture on respecting heirlooms. Internal laugh. Ethan, my younger brother, the family's perpetual latecomer, sauntered in a full 20 minutes after me, looking uncharacteristically rumpled, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. He received only warm, indulgent smiles from our parents, and an affectionate, "Ethan, darling, he were just about to start without you," from our mother, her voice laced with a fondness rarely directed my way, with such uncomplicated ease. No commentary on his tardiness, no questions about where he'd to rules. As always, internal laugh, were different. The beginning of dinner followed its usual, predictable script, a play I'd seen performed countless times. My father dominated the conversation, holding forth with his unwavering opinions on the latest political news, interspersed with pronouncements on the state of the economy and his recent successes in his business consulting firm. My mother, meanwhile, expertly interjected with carefully chosen questions about everyone's week, though these questions were rarely born of genuine curiosity. More often, they were cleverly disguised setups, opportunities for her to seamlessly transition into sharing the latest neighborhood gossip, or to subtly steer the conversation towards one of her preferred topics, usually Rachel's talents, or Ethan's potential. I was midway through delivering a practiced, heavily sanitized, and deliberately bland update about my current projects at work, carefully omitting any details that might invite too much scrutiny or unsolicited advice. When my father cleared his throat, it was a distinct, deliberate sound, not a cough, but a resonant clearing of the vocal. This was the universal signal in our family, the audible curtain rising on the main event, the real agenda for the evening. The true purpose of this particular gathering was about to begin. My stomach gave a familiar, nervous lurch. "Rachel has some news to share," my father announced, his voice taking on a certain gravitas, as if he were introducing a head of state about to deliver a pivotal address, rather than his often floundering elder daughter. My sister, Rachel, who until that moment had been surreptitiously scrolling through her phone beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, presumably checking her social media feeds or texting one of her many admirers, looked up with a practiced slowness. Her expression, which mere seconds before had been a mask of bored indifference, underwent a remarkably swift transformation, morphing into one of carefully constructed, delicate vulnerability. It was a look she had perfected over years of practice, designed to elicit maximum sympathy and minimal questioning. "Jason and we broke up," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, naming her now ex-boyfriend of approximately 8 months. Jace, I had met him exactly once. At a sprawling family barbecue the previous summer, he had spent the majority of that afternoon cornering anyone who would listen, myself included, to talk, at great length and with unnerving enthusiasm, about his various, highly speculative, internal laugh, cryptocurrency investments. He'd struck me as shallow and self-absorbed, but I'd kept that opinion, like so many others, to myself. He's being, Rachel continued, dabbing at the corner of an artfully dry eye, with a fingertip, just totally unreasonable, about the apartment lease. She paused for dramatic effect, ensuring all eyes were on her. He actually expects me to keep paying my half of the rent, even though I'm the one who has to move out. Can you believe it? My mother, predictably, reached across the table, her hand engulfing Rachel's, in a gesture of profound maternal sympathy. Oh, my poor darling, Mom cooed, her voice dripping with concern. That's just not right. It's barbaric. She shouldn't have to deal with this kind of financial stress, on top of a broken heart. It's too much for one person to bear. I nodded automatically, performing the expected sisterly response of silent support. Internally, however, I was already doing mental calculations. How long did I need to remain at this table, feigning appropriate levels of concern, before I could reasonably make my escape back to the sanity of my own, blessedly drama-free apartment? Another hour? An hour and a half, top. So, my father continued, his voice decisive, as he cut into his thick slice of pot roast, with almost surgical precision, completely unfazed by Rachel's tearful performance, or my mother's sympathetic despair. He was, as always, focused on the solution, his solution. We've thought it all through, and we've worked it all out. He paused, looking from my mother to Rachel.
Dad.
Then finally, his gaze settled on me. Rachel will move into your place, Olivia, just for a little while, of course, while she gets back on her feet. The casual, almost breezy delivery of this life-altering bombshell, this unilateral decision about my home, my life, made it all the more shocking, all the more infuriating. He might as well have been announcing a minor change in dinner plans, like switching from roast potatoes to mashed. Internal laugh, rather than orchestrating a full-scale invasion of my meticulously guarded personal space. My sanctuary fork, laden with a piece of carrot, clattered onto my plate, the sound unnaturally loud, in the sudden, ringing silence that followed his word. My mother, however, was already beaming, her expression one of serene maternal satisfaction, as if this was the most natural, most perfect solution in the world. She was already moving on to the practical logistics, her mind clearly several steps ahead. It just makes perfect sense, doesn't it? She chirped, looking around the table for agreement, though it was clearly a rhetorical question. Your lovely apartment, Olivia, has that wonderful spare room, the one you use as a sort of office, I think. She gestured vaguely, as if the room's current function was a trivial, easily dismissed detail. And you're always saying how you work such long hours at the office downtown anyway. You're hardly ever home in the evenings. This was a gross exaggeration. While I did work hard, I cherished my evenings and weekends, in my own quiet space. Rachel just needs a safe, supportive place, for a few months, Mom continued, her voice softening with concern, for her elder daughter. Just a little breathing room, to find her own place again, to heal, and to, you know, recover from all this trauma. I felt that familiar, suffocating tightness constrict my chest, the unmistakable physical manifestation of my boundaries being not just pushed, but utterly bulldozed, flattened by the sheer, unyielding force of my family's collective will. My wine suddenly felt like a lead weight in my stomach. I actually use my office, Mom, I managed to say, my voice emerging tighter, thinner than I intended. I chose my words carefully, measuring each one, like a precious, finite resource. I've been taking on more freelance projects lately. Environmental impact assessment. They require a dedicated, quiet workspace, and all my reference materials are set up in there. My sister, Rachel, whose trauma internal laugh seemed to have momentarily abated, rolled her eyes with an almost theatrical sigh of exasperation, not even bothering to hide her utter dismissal of my concern. "You'll, Olivia, don't be so dramatic," she said, her tone laced with that familiar, patronizing edge. "You can just work at the kitchen table, if you really need to. I did that all through college. It's perfectly fine." The unspoken, yet glaringly obvious, fact that her college experience had consisted of a leisurely, 5.5-year pursuit of an art died, a degree funded entirely, and very generously, by our parents, an experience punctuated by multiple mental health breaks, which usually involved lavishly funded trips to find inspiration, internal laugh, and which had resulted in a portfolio of decidedly average paintings, and a lingering sense of entitlement, went, as always, unmentioned and unacknowledged by anyone at the table. "It's just temporary, Olivia," my father added, his voice carrying a tone of absolute finality, as if that single, magic word, temporary, somehow addressed and nullified all possible objection. "You'll, my unspoken needs and concerns, a few months at most. Family helps family. That's what we do." My father's final words, "family helps family," hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a pronouncement as solid and unyielding as the oak table we sat around. My mother, already miles ahead in her logistical planning, was now fully engrossed with her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen. The faint tapping sounds were an irritating counterpoint to the drumming in my own ears. "We can help move her things next Saturday," she declared, not looking up, her voice bright and efficient. "That should give you plenty of time to, you know, make space, Olivia dear. Make space." Internal laugh, as if my life, my carefully arranged existence, was just an empty container waiting to be filled with Rachel's discarded dreams and immediate needs. "Your building has visitor parking, right?" she continued, finally glancing up at me, her brow furrowed in performative consideration, though the question was clearly a statement requiring confirmation, not an actual inquiry. "I seem to recall it's a bit tight on your street." I watched them, these two architects of my sudden displacement, as they began planning the systematic dismantling of my personal space, the sanctuary I had poured years of my life, my earnings, my very essence into creating. They discussed the logistics of moving Rachel's belongings, her oversized antique vanity that probably wouldn't even fit through my apartment door, her collection of vintage, mostly just old and damaged clothing, her various artistic supplies that rarely saw the light of day, with the same boundless enthusiasm, the same meticulous attention to detail they had once shown when planning Rachel's extravagant 16th birthday party. The party, I remembered with a fresh, sharp pang of bitterness that had completely overshadowed, in fact, entirely obliterated, any acknowledgement of my own 18th birthday, which had fallen just a week later. There had been no party for me, not even a cake, just a casually handed card with a $20 bill tucked inside, and a vague promise of doing something special later, a later that, of course, internal laugh, never materialized. My brother, Ethan, who had been diligently applying himself to his third helping of pot roast, momentarily caught my eye across the table. His own gaze, usually so carefree and untroubled, flickered with something I couldn't quite decipher. Was it sympathy? Or perhaps just discomfort? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He looked away almost immediately, his attention suddenly re-riveted to the contents of his plate, clearly unwilling to be drawn into a conflict that didn't directly involve him or threaten his own comfortable status quo. He was a master of strategic disengagement when family dramas erupted, a skill I sometimes envied. I recognized the familiar, suffocating crossroads before me. Option 1. Speak up. Voice my outrage, my absolute refusal, and in doing so, face the inevitable, crushing wave of collective disapproval from my united family. Endure the accusations of selfishness, the lectures on loyalty, the tearful manipulations from my mother, the stern disappointment from my father, and the petulant fury from Rachel. Option 2. Remain silent, swallow the bitter pill of injustice, yet again, surrender my hard-won boundaries, my precious autonomy, my very home, for the sake of a fragile, illusory peace. This time, however, as the weight of their expectations pressed down on me, something inside me, something deep and fundamental, shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion of courage, not exactly. It was more like the slow, grinding tectonic plates of my psyche, finally, irrevocably, realigning. Instead of the anxious, desperate need to please, the ingrained fear of disapproval that usually accompanied these moments of confrontation, I felt a strange, almost preternatural calm settle over me, a chilling, resolute clarity. "I'll need to check my lease agreement," I said, my voice surprisingly neutral, devoid of the tremor I had anticipated. About the policy on long-term guests and sublet. I was careful not to agree, but also, crucially, not to refuse outright. Not yet. That would come later. On my My mother waved her hand dismissively, a gesture of airy impatience, as if swatting away an irrelevant gnat. "Oh, of course, dear," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You do that, but that's all just formality, isn't it?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "They can't really stop you from helping your own sister in her time of need. Family is family, after all." I nodded again, a slow, deliberate inclination of my head, letting them believe their narrative, letting them bask in the warm glow of their assumed victory. My compliance, they would undoubtedly think, was assured, but mentally, behind the carefully constructed mask of acquiescence, I was already drafting a completely different, a plan that involved less family discussion and more strategic, unilateral action. The conversation, or rather, their monologue, then shifted seamlessly back to the logistics of Rachel's impending move into my life. No one bothered to ask if I had any existing plans for the upcoming weekend, the weekend they had so generously commandeered for their own purposes. No one considered for a moment that I might have work commitments, personal appointments, or simply a desire to exist in my own home without uninvited, long-term company. Internal laugh. Any considerations they might have overlooked regarding my life, my preferences, my prior engagements, were simply non-existent in their self-centered calculation. I offered only minimal, monosyllabic responses, vague hums of non-agreement, letting them mistake my calculated quietness, my strategic retreat into observation, for an actual agreement. As I robotically helped clear the dessert plates, my mother's overly sweet apple crumble, a dish I usually enjoyed, but now found cloying, I was meticulously mapping out my counter-offensive. In the determined corners of my mind, I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I had finally reached the point of no return. Acquiescence, the path of least resistance I had trodden for so many years, was no longer an option I could live with. Not this time, not any. The drive home from my parents' house had never felt so charged, so liberating. My old Honda Civic, usually just a means of transport, felt like a transitional space, a chrysalis, where the due to accommodating daughter I had always been was being shed, replaced by a woman finally, if terrifyingly, ready to take control of her own narrative. Sitting in my car, parked just outside my apartment building, the city lights blurring through the windshield, I turned off the engine, but didn't immediately get out. The familiar post-family dinner emotional hangover, that cloying mix of resentment and resignation, was settling in. But this time, it came with a new, electrifying sensation, something caught between righteous, ice-cold anger, and absolute, diamond-hard clarity. I played the dinner conversation over and over in my mind, each word, each intonation, each dismissive gesture, seared into my memory. My parents' voices, so confident, so assured, casually assigning my sister to my home, to my life, without a single genuine question about my thoughts, my feelings, my existing commitment. The pattern, their lifelong pattern of benevolent tyranny, was so starkly clear now that I could almost laugh at its grotesque predictability, internal laugh. My needs, always subordinate, my space, my time, my very autonomy, treated as community resources, freely available for their disposal, while my siblings, particularly Rachel, were sacrosanct, their whims catered to, their flaws excused. I thought about all the times, countless times, I had swallowed my objections, choked down my own needs, in the name of keeping the peace, a peace that was always, always on their terms. All the small surrenders, the tiny compromises that had accumulated over the years into this crushing expectation that I would always bend, always yield, always accommodate. Not this time, I whispered, my voice a low, fierce growl, to my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was surprised by the steadiness in that voice, a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed. Inside my apartment, my sanctuary, I kicked off my shoes, with a sigh that was part exhaustion, part defiance. I walked through each room, seeing it with fresh, fiercely protective eyes, appreciating anew the haven I had painstakingly built for myself. The office, my office, the one they had so casually suggested I dismantle, contained not just my workspace, my computer, my reference books, but the physical representation of dreams I was still actively building, projects that mattered deeply to me, regardless of whether my family understood, or even acknowledging, their value. I sat at my desk, the worn wood cool beneath my fingertips, and opened my laptop. A cold, methodical determination was rapidly replacing the weary resignation I usually felt after these family encounters. First, I reviewed my lease agreement online, confirming what I already suspected. Subletting without explicit management approval was strictly prohibited. Guests staying longer than 2 weeks needed to be formally added to the lease, a process involving proper background checks and credit reports. These weren't obstacles, these were my weapons. Then, an idea, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of my anger. My colleague, Derek, he'd mentioned just last week, quite casually over coffee, that his condo was undergoing some emergency plumbing repairs, and he might need a place to crash for a week or two. He was responsible, professional, and crucially, completely unknown to my family. He was perfect. I wouldn't just tell them the room wasn't available, I would make it unavailable. The plan solidified with breathtaking speed. I would call Derek first thing in the morning, offer him the room for a nominal rent for 2 weeks, starting immediately. We'd sign a simple temporary agreement. I'd notify building management of my short-term guest, and then, When my family arrived on Saturday, brimming with entitlement and Rachel's luggage, they wouldn't find an empty room waiting for their prince. They would find Derek, a polite stranger, legally and legitimately occupying the space. The sheer, beautiful audacity of it made a grim smile touch my lips. The week that followed was a blur of methodical precision and barely suppressed anxiety. Derek, bless his uncomplicated soul, was grateful for the offer and readily agreed. We signed the agreement on Monday. I notified building management on Tuesday, framing it as a friend helping out a colleague in a bind. They were fine with it, given the short duration and my good standing as a tenant. Meanwhile, the texts and calls from my mother and Rachel about the move continued, each one a fresh wave of presumption. I met with deliberately vague, non-committal response. Still figuring out logistics, I'd text back, or swamped with work, let's touch base later. By Friday evening, Derek had moved a small bag into the spare room. I gave him a set of keys and a detailed, slightly apologetic explanation of what he might expect on Saturday morning. He, to his eternal credit, just grinned and said, "Consider it my a little live-action theater." Saturday morning dawned crisp and bright. I was a bundle of nerves, pacing my living room, coffee untouched. Derek was calmly reading a book in the spare room, now his room, at least for the next 2 weeks. At precisely 10:58 a.m., 2 minutes early, the doorbell rang. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and pasted on a polite, neutral smile. There they stood, my father, looking impatient, my mother, beaming expectantly, and Rachel, flanked by 2 large suitcases and a mountain of assorted bags, a triumphant smirk already playing on her lip. "Olivia, darling," my mother chirped, "we're here, ready to get Rachel all settled in." "Actually, Mom, Dad, Rachel," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "there's been a slight change of plans." Their smiles faltered. Confusion clouded their faces. "What do you mean, Olivia?" my father asked, his tone already sharpening. "Well," I said, gesturing vaguely towards the spare room, "as it turns out, the room isn't actually available. My colleague Derek needed a place to stay urgently due to some issues with his apartment, and he moved in yesterday. He'll be here for the next couple of weeks." Just then, as if on cue, Derek emerged from the spare room, looking politely curious. "Oh, morning, Olivia. Are these your folks?" The silence that followed was monumental. My mother's jaw literally dropped. Rachel's face went from triumphant smirk to slack-jawed disbelief, then to a furious, mottled red. My father's expression hardened into a mask of cold, incredulous anger. "What is the meaning of this, Olivia?" he finally thundered, his voice echoing slightly in my small hallway. "It means, Dad," I said, standing my ground, my voice calm despite the tremor in my hands, "that my apartment and my spare room are currently occupied. I did check my lease, by the way, and long-term guests, or sublets, require formal approval, which, naturally, Rachel doesn't have." The confrontation that ensued was everything I had dreaded, and yet, somehow, I weathered. There were tears, my mother, accusations, "Rachel, you planned this, you hate me," and thinly veiled threats, my father, "This is not how family behaves, Olivia. There will be consequences." But for the first time in my life, I didn't back down. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to smooth things over. I simply stated the facts, calmly, and repeated. Derek, bless him, played his part perfectly, offering polite but firm confirmations that yes, he was indeed staying there, and no, he wasn't planning on leaving. Eventually, defeated and fuming, they retreated. Rachel's suitcases were dragged, with much dramatic sighing and muttered curses, back down to their car. The aftermath was chilly, to say the least. Weeks of strained silence, punctuated by guilt-tripping texts from my mother and stony glares from my father at the next very awkward family dinner, but something had irrevocably changed. I had drawn a line, a clear, unmistakable line. My apartment, my sanctuary, remained mine, and I, Olivia Jensen, had finally, 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 finally found my. It was a difficult, painful victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, and it was, without a doubt, entirely mine.